If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, what is the creepiest, unsettling thing that has ever actually happened to you? I work in a pub. It's about 2 miles away in the next village. I usually finish work late, 1 to 2 a.m., and I have to cycle home. The only route is a small road that goes through somewhat large woods. There's a 1-mile stretch that has absolutely no street lights. It's pitch black. As I was cycling through the woods, I started hearing this screeching sound, similar to a small animal dying. It scared the shit out of me, so I started pedaling fast. I continued to hear it, and it seemed as though it was progressing towards me. I use my phone's camera light to navigate, although it isn't impossible to see without it. I point my phone behind me, and I swear I caught sight of some ducking humanoid creature on all fours running at me. Call it mind games, but this was pretty vivid. I continue to cycle as fast as I can. I've been cycling long distances from a young age. I'd like to say I'm quite fast, yet I continue to hear the screeching and the light padding of the footsteps of whatever is chasing me. I try to turn my phone light off, and after a few seconds, I manage to do so. The padding becomes quieter, and I hear one last screech from whatever it was. I have never been so scared in all my life. There is a pretty old cemetery in the center of my neighborhood in Philadelphia. I walk my dog by this cemetery nightly and have even let her wander off-leash through the gravesites a few times. Not too long ago, I was out with my dog and noticed eggs and pumpkins thrown all over the street corners. You could hear yelling and laughing coming from different blocks, so I knew the neighborhood kids were out causing trouble. It may have been mischief night, but I walk my dog nightly, so I really don't remember. Anyway, we're doing our usual cemetery lap. My dog is in front, ears perked, wary of the neighborhood noises. We get to one particular intersection, and my dog goes still, tail between her legs and hair raised. I'm searching the streets for any creeps but can see no one, so I try to continue our walk home. She starts walking slowly, head lowered, but peering up into the cemetery trees. She let loose a few low growls and started pulling us away from the cemetery. Now there's no one in sight, no cars or pedestrians, just the sound of kids running amok a few blocks away, but I started to pick up noises coming from inside the cemetery, and my dog will not take her eyes off the canopy. The gates are usually locked at 5, so I start peering through the metal fence to see who's in there. My dog is now attempting to push me away from the corner and drops low every time I get closer to the fence. I can now hear low, dull thuds and the crunching sound of fallen leaves. The sounds were coming from directly in front of me, but I couldn't see anyone or anything in the cemetery. I turned my ass around, and we sped home. I did some research on the cemetery and learned of a story about a man hanging himself from a tree near the edge of the cemetery. I've read some other stories of the guy hanging there all night and people even getting in their cars to go to work without noticing him hanging there. It could have been an owl, hawk, or Keebler elf, but where's the romance in that? Many years ago, I spent nights with a lady friend. She had had trouble sleeping, so she started taking Ambien. One night, she woke up trying to unlock her apartment door with her car keys from the inside. I went to the doctor and got off the medication. In the meantime, she needed someone to stay with her until the meds wore off. So, picture the two of us young adults snuggled up in a twin-sized bed in her apartment and me not letting her, all of 90 pounds, get up and walk around while tripping balls on Ambien and Ambien withdrawals. I woke up in the middle of the night to a presence in the room, and there was a small child standing beside her side of the bed. I turn slightly and can see the same child standing behind me, opposite the first. Thoroughly creepy, no? Then they disappear. Okay. Maybe I'm tripping too, right? Except I'm straight edge. Whatever, my mind is playing tricks on me. I woke up before her the next morning, started to get up, and found the sheets were tucked under the mattress, clear up to our necks. So I laid there until she woke up and watched her, and I watched her struggle with the bed sheets. Now, I'm a light sleeper, and we never slept with the bed sheets tucked under the bed. In fact, she was pretty analytical about making sure the sheets were loose. So I asked her about the sheets, and she described, paraphrasing 10 years later, a boy of 7 or 8 years of age that visits her in the night, and, I quote, he tucks me in. So far, he's been harmless. It was summer. It was hot. And I still ducking shivered. The school I used to go to back in my home country always used to warn the students about goblins living in the wooded area behind our school. It's probably just a safety measure to keep the kids out of the woods. I curiously made my way there one day and found a mound of dirt, oddly shaped, almost like a dog's head. Typical of the kid that I was, I kicked it around, destroying it. I'm not sure what I did after that, but I remember coming back no less than 15 to 30 minutes later, and the mound of dirt was exactly the way it was prior to my needlessly destroying it. I bolted out of there. It sounds stupid and a bit bizarre, but it's really the only experience I've had that one can consider paranormal, in my 27 years of life. I was only maybe 6 years old when this happened, so it may just be a memory I somehow fabricated, but it has stuck through the years. A few years ago, I was bow hunting in a large national forest in northern Wisconsin. It was early November, and all the leaves were off the trees. I ended up staying in my tree stand way too late and didn't start walking out until it was almost completely dark. The walkout from where I was consisted of about 3/4 of a mile walking through dense jack pines and mixed hardwoods before hitting a logging trail that would take me to my car about a mile down the trail. I had been walking for about 10 minutes when I started getting the sensation that I was being followed. I eventually hit the logging road after a few hundred yards. I heard something walking in the woods a little ways behind me. As I kept walking, it became obvious that I was being followed. Every time I slowed my pace or stopped walking, I could hear whatever was coming to a stop as well. I'd seen predators in the area before, but every time I'd see bears or wolves, they were afraid and didn't want anything to do with humans. Whatever it was continued to follow me almost the entire way out to my car. As soon as I got into remote range, I hit the panic button on my key remote and set off my car's alarm. I kept it going until I got all the way back to my car. I never did figure out what was following me, but it was by far the spookiest feeling I have ever experienced. I was walking home from a friend's house in college on a really foggy night. This fog was so heavy that it was difficult to see more than 20 feet ahead of you. Anyways, right in front of me, I see a large group of people walking towards me and decide that I am going to avoid walking past them because the only people who roll in large groups like that are freshmen. It was around 2 on a Friday, and I didn't feel like dealing with drunk idiots. As I'm about to turn onto another street, I take another glance at the group and see an American flag waving. Following the flag was a group of Union Civil War soldiers walking 2 by 2 down this path. Curious as to why Civil War reenactors would be around so early in the morning, I kept walking towards them to ask them what they were doing. I shit you not, these soldiers just disappeared into the fog when I got within 15 feet. Like gone. No trace. I went straight to my house and tried to get whatever sleep I could, but the whole situation had me pretty ducked up. The next day, when I was thinking about it, I realized that they were walking towards the football stadium, which used to be a Union Civil War camp. It still gives me chills. I was hiking with my girlfriend and our dog, a German Shepherd 1-year-old pup, in a region of Transylvania. Instead of hiking up the mountain, we followed a trail that we realized was kind of shitty halfway. It went through the woods pretty much, and I was freaked out because I saw a caution, bears sign. Where I'm from, there's no bear, let alone brown bears. I even downloaded a shitty bear repellent app that played a random bell sound to signal to any close by bears to get the duck away. There were also some foresters around, chopping trees on a small site. Anyway, I took plenty of pictures, nothing happened. We turned back next to a waterfall since it was getting dark and headed back to our hotel. A couple days later, I was checking the photos I took, all pretty and uneventful. Except for the one I took by the waterfall when we turned back. At the time, I just thought it looked pretty cool and snapped a real quick photo because my girlfriend was getting pissed at the shit trail we picked. Next to the waterfall, there was a black figure or object I couldn't identify, so I zoomed in. My blood froze. It's the strangest thing I've ever seen, and I can't really explain what it is. It's a bear-like creature, but it looks too small to be a bear. Too malicious. I've tried to match it with the surroundings, but there's without a doubt something there. It's not just low-resolution zooming. There's something in that photo. There's more. Our dog didn't even flinch at the time of the event, until about 2 to 3 minutes later down the road, when he turned around and whined or drooled, then gathered us up. We waved it off since he himself was hardly freaked out anyway. So it was either a stray brown bear cub, and we were possibly in the middle of the path between it and its mom, which is terrifying enough, or something I can't identify. Ever since I saw the photo, I have had the feeling that we were being stalked that day in the woods. Growing up, my mom was a bartender. She was a single parent, so I took care of my little brother most nights. One night while I was making dinner, I kept hearing a strange whistling sound, but I didn't think much of it because it was storming pretty hard outside. But the whistling continued, and it started to sound more like a melody than whistling from a storm. I started to get a little freaked out and asked my little brother if he was hearing it too. He wasn't. Eventually the whistling stops, but it's still storming pretty badly. Fast forward to the end of the night, when I'm going to bed. I'm climbing up the ladder of my bunk bed, and my TV shuts off. I think maybe the power went out, but the hallway light is still on. I try to turn it back on, but nothing happens, so I reach around my TV stand and realize that it's been unplugged. At the same time, I hear the whistling, only this time not in the distance. It sounded like someone was whistling directly into my ear. I could almost feel their breath. It sent chills down my spine. It still sends chills down my spine. At that moment, I took off, running out of our house screaming. We lived in an apartment with 3 other units, so I woke up the neighbors above us. They were a younger couple with 2 kids and offered to come check out our house. I could tell at the time that the guy thought I was just a stupid kid hearing things but was trying to make me feel better. My brother and I waited outside of our apartment while he went inside to check it out for us. After a few minutes, he came back, and he seemed a little agitated and asked if you were playing a prank on him. This really scared me, and I told him we weren't playing a prank on him. He could probably see we were telling the truth through our faces, because I could see the fear roll over his face. He said he looked everywhere and did not find anyone, but was convinced someone was in our home. They invited us to stay in their apartment until my mom was home from work because they didn't feel comfortable with us staying alone. I never heard the whistling again, but so many other strange things happened to my brother and me in that apartment. I'm convinced it was haunted. My next door neighbors are kind of old, and since they're retired, they run a sort of mega babysitting company thing to keep busy. A bunch of people in the neighborhood drop their kids off at the NDNs. These people don't have much control over these children. And we don't have a fence separating our backyards. So one night, these people are holding a slumber party of sorts. Right next door. I can't ducking sleep because of the screaming shits next door, so I get up and go to the bathroom. I look out the bathroom window, and a crap ton of little kids are standing in my backyard, very still, staring at the stars or something like that. I probably should have connected the dots from there, but in the moment, I was freaking the duck out. The next day, I found little handprints on most of my downstairs windows. When I used to go to college, I had to cut through a particular cemetery. Lack of space meant very few people had been buried there since the 1900s. Anyway, under this one tree was the grave of a very young girl, just on its own. She said her name and the date she died, 1885, age 12. I don't know why, but I always got a solemn feeling as I walked past the grave every single day. Eventually, it consumed me. I had no idea why I was getting that feeling walking past the grave, so I searched her name. Within about a week, I had found out who she was and why she was buried there. She was buried there after suffering from a lung complaint. According to the family Bible, she died most peaceably in her mother's arms. Shortly after she died, her family left Brighton and founded a private school close to London. From what I can tell, the family never once returned to Brighton to visit her grave. I worked with the family biographer for a while, digging up as much as we could about this girl because he had barely heard of her except for the death certificate and the mention in the family Bible. It is like they erased her from the last 50 years of their lives. After a while, the trail went cold. I still had thoughts of how sad it was that this girl never had her family visit her after she died, and, once again, those thoughts consumed me. I fell asleep one night and dreamed of her and her dad. She told me she was fine now. I never dreamed of her again after that point, and the uneasy feeling went away as I walked past her grave. A couple of months later, the guy I was working with emailed me a picture. He had found a photograph of her. The problem? It was death photography, because that is what they did in that day and age, as it was too expensive to regularly hire a photographer. So, the only existing picture of her is from the day she died. The kicker? The girl in that photograph looked exactly like the girl that I saw in my dream, the one who told me she was fine now. Up until I left England, I left flowers by her grave. This was the only grave in the whole cemetery that ever had flowers by it. My friends do it to this day because nobody deserves to be forgotten, even in death. We live in an old cottage on the edge of a tiny village. There is a very long garden that has hilly fields beyond. We have a platform, so you can see the view and often have a drink out there and watch the sunset. It's miles from anywhere, but there is a public footpath that crosses the field. On New Year's Eve, we like to go out at midnight, have a drink, and watch the fireworks from the city on the horizon. So, 2 years ago, as the bells on our radio chime, we see a figure walking across the fields, away from the village, so we shout and wish him a happy new year. No response, so we kind of wonder what somebody is doing out on their own in the middle of nowhere at that time. Maybe you had a strop and left a party? Last year, the same thing happened, except our adult son and his mate were with us. The exact same thing happens. Same figure, it's dark, so we can't see faces or clothing clearly. I tell them about last year and how weird it is because the footpath leads across 5 miles of fields, no houses nearby, and very odd if it's a partygoer to be leaving on the stroke of midnight. I look back up, and the guy has vanished. Vanished from an open field. There's no way he could have run to the tree line at that time. Okay, it was dark, but 4 of us saw him there, and then we turned to look, and he wasn't. I have no rational explanation for this. This actually happened. I'm serious, the only reason I even tell people is because my friend saw it with me, and we still talk about it to this day. A 16 or 17-year-old friend came by to tutor me in calculus. About 10 p.m. at night, I let my friend drive my car to his house. He lived out on the outskirts of town, where there were nothing but almond orchards. Passed by a cattle ranch with lots of lights. Silence in the car. I'm on shotgun, and I ducking see a bull running on its 2 legs like a human. The bull turns its head towards us. Red glowing eyes. Bull looks like it's getting ready to spin around but then evaporates. Look towards my friend and ask him, "Did you see that?" My friend replies, "Did it look like a bull running on 2 legs with red glowing eyes, and then it disappeared?" "Yes, I saw that." WTF. That was about 10 years ago. My coworker came in on his day off just to tell me that his friend saw the exact same thing 6 years after the incident. My ex didn't see anything, he was on his cell phone. I hesitate to tell this story because of the memories that it triggers. It also seems more real. 4 years ago, I was the only person who stayed back for Thanksgiving on my dorm floor. Everyone else had left to go visit their families. The shower was located down a long hallway. I hated this hallway. It was newly painted, but something about it always made me uneasy. I debated for a while whether I should take a shower that night until I finally mustered up the courage. Everything was fine on my way there. While I showered, I swear I heard someone laughing. I couldn't decide if it was someone playing a joke, my imagination, or something else. When I left the shower, the stupid hallway lights were out, of all times. I walked at a brisk pace because I didn't want anyone to think that I was scared. Then it happened. Halfway to my room, I felt something grab me around my ankles. It felt like a hand, but it wasn't warm or even human. It was cold and lifeless. I felt a flush of fear, and I bolted to my room. I kept all the lights on for the rest of the night and kept my eyes on the crack under my door. It was terrifying. In the early 2000s, my family bought a house in Garden Grove, California, that used to be the neighborhood crack house, with a lot of stories that went along with it. One of the more predominant features of the front room was the large ballet mirror that took up most of the back wall. The thing was like 16 feet long. One day I came home from school and sat my book bags down on the couch that was right next to the mirror. I was getting ready to sit down when I saw something in the mirror. There was a black thing in the mirror. It was vaguely humanoid shaped, but it was just a black mass of something. I immediately thought it was a person and turned around to see if a guy had followed me into the house. Nothing. Turned back to the mirror. Nothing. My mom also claimed to have seen a man in the mirror, and it really freaked her out. We ended up taking the thing down during renovations. So I live in the rural area of Indiana, US. It's pretty stereotypical, a gravel road surrounded by cornfields and all that. It gets pretty spooky at times. Cornfields are creepy at night, and it always sounds like something is running through them, dark twisting shadows from trees in our yard, occasionally weird animal calls, yada yada yada. One time I forgot to feed the outside dogs during the afternoon, so I had to go out back and feed them even though it was dark out. When I turned around, I swear I saw a figure lumbering over the peak of the roof behind the chimney, like it was hiding from me. It terrified me, and I sprinted back inside, which actually felt more scary considering I was running in the direction of the thing I just thought I saw. But the real story comes from a few weeks ago, and that fleeting thought scared me so bad. With such a bit of backstory, my dog can best be described as a punk. He's a miniature schnauzer, but he thinks he's big and scary. He is fearless to a pretty stupid degree. We had a pack of coyotes walk through our empty field, and I had to sprint and tackle him to stop him from confronting the entire pack, growling and barking the whole way. Same story when he escaped the fence and went for a nearby neighbor's 2 angry boxers. So animals don't scare my stupid dog, and as I mentioned, he had gotten into the habit of escaping his fence. So one night, it's like 3 a.m., and he wakes me up and is whining and groaning and clearly has to go outside. Well, he had been escaping, and I hadn't fixed the fence, so I hooked a leash on him and went outside. The motion light came on, and I could see that it was insanely foggy. The fog was so thick I could barely see the car in the drive, maybe 30 feet from where I was standing. So I was a little unsettled. But I take him out, and he does his business, and he starts sniffing around. And he was kind of whining, like he was smelling something weird, and he started circling and being agitated. Well, I thought I'd walk him through the yard to calm him down so I could go back to sleep. Well, like I said, he has never been scared of another animal. And his response to seeing anything is to run up to it, barking. But he stopped and focused hard, and his breathing started going really fast. But he was standing close by me, not pulling on the leash. I followed his gaze, and I saw this dark figure, bigger than a person, lumbering across the yard. It almost looked like a large person hunched over, maybe on 4 legs, maybe not. Bear-sized, but I've never ever seen a bear anywhere near here. Cornfields and towns between 2 cities are where I live. No bears. The fact that he was clearly scared and didn't want to engage in this thing, mixed with the fact that I couldn't tell what it was at all, made me run back inside, and he very happily followed. He sat down once inside and just looked up at me, whining like he was scared. The single most terrifying experience of my life. A few years ago, I was camping in the middle of nowhere with my fellow Boy Scouts. Everything was great, and we were having fun, but then it turned out a little kid from a different pack had gone missing after running into the woods. Of course, everyone in the camp quickly covered every single inch of the woods. However, my group encountered something different. We saw the outline of a small child running through the woods in all different directions, so of course we followed him, thinking it was the missing boy. As cliché as it sounds, there was an abandoned cabin that we ended up arriving at. It would have been beautiful had there not been a bunch of scared to death 10-year-olds. Well, now we hear laughter from inside the cabin, not some evil laugh or something, just the laugh of a little boy. Well, my pack leader runs in, only to find nobody inside. After 20 more minutes of looking, we all head back to report what we saw to the father of the missing child. Well, the father, after hearing no one can find his son, decides to go lay down inside his tent. Inside the tent is the missing boy, playing with some sticks. I still have absolutely no clue what we were chasing in the woods, and it still gives me chills to this day. When I was around 13 to 14, I had my mom drive me home from a family friend gathering. It was dark outside, and when we turned onto our street, we saw this decrepit woman with long, stringy hair, dressed in what looked like a long black cloak, with a man helping her walk. She was making these inhuman movements. It was almost like she was a creature. The closest thing I can compare her to is the girl from The Ring, but in elderly woman form. As soon as the headlights shined on her, my mom and I were both scared shitless. We kind of nervously laughed it off as she dropped me off, pretending it wasn't that horrifying. 5 minutes later, she pulled back into the driveway and made me come back to the party. She said she couldn't leave me home alone after seeing that woman or thing. To this day, we still have no idea who she was, why she could barely walk, or why she was walking in the middle of the night. No one else ever saw her. A few weeks later, my mom and I saw her again in the middle of the night, and then we never saw her again. Keep in mind that we live in a small, somewhat secluded neighborhood, and we pretty much know everyone who lives here. I'm 24 now, and the thought of her still gives me chills. Back in 2013, I was hiking with a friend. We hadn't actually intended to be out after dark, but the hike took longer than anticipated, so it was fully dark when we got back to our car. My friend had to use the bathroom, so we stopped at one of those little bathroom shacks that was located near the front of the park we were leaving. The bathroom hut was up against a paved trail that was popular with joggers and had bushes and small trees surrounding it. My friend hopped out of the car and headed up to the bathroom. He stopped dead in his tracks, froze for a second, then booked it full speed back into the car. He yelled, "Get the duck out of here," jumping in the car, and we were out of the parking area before the door was even shut. I asked him what the duck happened, and he responded that there was a man fully dressed in black hiding in the bushes by the bathroom entrance. It freaked me the duck out, especially since this was a jogging trail, so I assumed the guy was staked out waiting for a solo jogger to come along. So there's a pretty popular haunted cemetery by my house called Bachelor's Grove. My ex and I liked to go there when we were bored. There's a single half-mile entrance that leads into the forest or cemetery. No one was in front of us, and no one was behind us. We were in the empty cemetery, and someone started walking up to one of the graves on our left. The entrance was on our right. This man had long black hair and carried a giant black box, which looked like a gun box. I assumed it was ghost hunting equipment or a gun box. I didn't feel right, but I didn't want to show this guy or thing. I was scared of it, so we stayed in the cemetery. We walked down to the pond, and when we came back, he was gone. It was very humbling because we were in the middle of the forest. Had this guy had a gun, he could have done whatever he wanted to us. I was riding my horse along a track that I'd only been on once before. I had my friend with me, who was walking and sometimes doubling with me. We stopped overlooking a bit of a valley to smoke a cigarette, naughty teenagers. We were very careful to extinguish our smokes properly, as being raised in the Australian bush, you are very aware of the dangers of fire. We were concentrating on picking up our cigarette butts and putting them in a little tin I had for this purpose when my horse started to get a bit jumpy. We both noticed a wrongness in the air around us. Everything looked the same but felt very sinister. A breeze picked up suddenly, and it felt really cold. Summer in Western Australia is never cold. I warily got back on my horse, and my friend and I were still just looking around us, trying to figure out why everything felt so strange. At that moment, the breeze turned into a strong wind, and we both noticed at the same time that the leaves on all the gum trees around us were not moving even 1 millimeter. Needless to say, I grabbed my friend's arm and pulled her up behind me, and we hauled her out of there. My horse was so spooked he didn't want to stop even when we were away from the wind, and leaves were once again moving normally. I live in the mountains of western North Carolina and spend a lot of time driving around at night, camping, and just being outside in general, so I've got literal hours of stories that I've witnessed in my 22 years of life, from UFOs, ghosts, shadow people, dismembered hands, ritual sites, government vehicles on abandoned roads, almost anything and everything creepy possible. But the one that I have absolutely no clue as to what happened was about 8 years ago, when me and 3 other of my friends were driving around about 12 to 1 in the morning, pitch black on a road with a few lights and houses on it. It's normally a busy road, and we hadn't seen anyone but one car. Well, we're driving down the road, and another car comes towards us, and out of nowhere, the brightest blue light I've ever seen in my life drops from the sky. My friend slams on the brakes of her car, our radio goes black, and the thing just hovers for 10 to 15 seconds, about 10 feet from the ground. There's a bright white flash, and it shoots up, and it's gone. Nothing can be seen in the sky. The other cars completely stopped too, and we're about 100 yards from each other. We both just started slowly driving away, never knowing what it was. Was young, probably about 13 years old. I had a sleepover with a bunch of girls at one of their houses for a birthday party. She was pretty rich but had just moved into the house, so there were no curtains on the enormous windows. We live in a more rural setting. She lives literally behind my house but connected to a different road. Like a country block, she lives on the road parallel to mine, with a huge cornfield and a cemetery separating us. It is nighttime, we're all up doing, I don't even know what, probably playing stupid kid games, when one of the girls gasps really loudly and like dramatically, and we all kind of jump. Her mother and father had already gone off to bed upstairs. The girl says, "There's a guy at the window," and we all look, and sure enough, a black silhouette is there, staring in. I couldn't make much else out. But he was directly on the side of the house that faced the cemetery, and it was freaky. So anyway, there's a house closer to the cemetery that houses this guy who is mentally insane and went crazy around our neighborhood with a shotgun. He eventually went on house arrest, and I still pass by this house a lot and get chills from it. I'd put money on it being that guy. In May 1985, my friend, Lisa, and I were returning to the US. We had spent a week wandering and camping in Canada. We're both female, by the way. Being 20 years old, we had scarcely any money, and we had just spent the last of it on gas, so we needed to make it home. We drove late into the night. By 1 a.m., we still had a few hours to go. We were traveling south on Route 84 to Moline, Illinois. Lisa was driving, and we were having a great time. We chatted up a storm as we made our way down that little 2-lane highway. It's probably a scenic road by day. But at night, everything was pitch black. Suddenly, a shape appeared at the very edge of our headlights. It looked like a log was lying in the opposite lane. As we got closer, the log turned out to be the legs of a man sitting on the highway. As we got even closer, we could see that the man was sitting on the solid white line of the opposite lane. His legs were jutting straight out onto the highway and would have been run over if a car had been coming from the other direction. We slowed down. Lisa started to swerve towards him. We said a few things, like, "I wonder if he needs help and I wonder what he's doing out here in the middle of nowhere." The headlights completely illuminated him as we drove towards him. He sat facing the opposite side of the road, so we were looking at him in profile. He was wearing a brown suit, brown shoes, and a brown hat. His arms hung down by his sides. At first, he did not move or acknowledge us in any way. We stared at him in silence. Suddenly, he jerked his face towards us. His eyes were glowing red. His mouth opened and twisted into a snarl. We were completely terrified. To Lisa's credit, she reacted quickly by swerving away from him, punching the gas, and making a getaway as fast as she could. As we sped away, we both turned to look out the back window, but neither of us could see anything in the darkness. We couldn't shake the feeling of wrongness. It felt like we had stumbled across something we weren't supposed to see. It looked and dressed like a man, but those glowing red eyes were not human. This takes place in March and April of 2013. Me and a friend had just been to the movies and were just walking around at 10:45 p.m. We decided we would take a shortcut through the schoolyard of our old school, which had since been abandoned and was in pretty bad shape. As we walked through the schoolyard, we decided to try to get inside the school building and explore a little bit. We used our cell phones as flashlights and made sure not to point them towards the windows to avoid being seen. We went down one of the corridors and started exploring the classrooms. We had just come out of the third classroom and were in the corridor when we heard someone moving the tarp or plastic sheet in the main hall. This was not wind or anything, we could definitely tell someone was physically moving it. We could also hear footsteps, although the rhythm of the steps was kind of weird. It sounded like someone changed their walking pace sporadically, if that makes any sense. We immediately went inside a classroom to hide, as we thought someone had called security on us. We hid behind the door in the classroom for about 2 minutes, dead quiet. We didn't hear anything else during this time, so we figured it had to be the wind or just random noises. We decided to keep going. We went through the corridor and up the stairs at the other end of the main hall and explored the second floor. While we were there, we would occasionally hear some noises, but we just brushed them off as wind. After a while, we had explored the rest of the corridor, and we decided to walk down the staircase that led from the second floor to the hall. Halfway down the staircase, there was this plateau before the second set of stairs, and this is where things took a turn. We could see the plastic from there, and it was moving. We also heard some kind of scratching noise. We stood there for a second just listening, and I decided to peek around the corner to see what was making that sound. What I saw scared the living shit out of me. It was some kind of creature. It was skinny, almost completely naked, I couldn't see any clothes at least, had really thin strands of hair, and was really pale. Like corpse pale, almost completely white. The first thing that came to mind was that this thing looked like Gollum, just bigger. It was crouching down and scratching the floor or something, and it made some weird, growly, groany, breathy noises. It was facing away from us, so I just stood frozen for a good while and watched it. I took a step back and just pointed at this thing and looked at my friend. He peeked around the corner, and immediately I could see his facial expression change into a combination of horror and shock. It was reassuring in a way, knowing that he saw it too. We just stood there for a good 20 seconds just watching this thing do whatever it was doing, and the most cliché horror movie thing happened. My friend started backing away slowly, and while doing so, he stepped on a piece of glass that cracked. This startled the creature, and it quickly looked over its shoulder right at me. I just bolted at that point. We ran all the way to the basement to get out, and the whole way there, I swear, it felt like it was right behind us. We ran back to my friend's house, and when we got there, we had a kind of debriefing session, making sure we both saw the same thing. The only explanation I can think of is that it was a homeless dude who, for some reason, was naked in this abandoned school, but this is in northern Norway during winter, you wouldn't survive very long without clothes. Also, I live in a very small town with very few, if any, homeless people, so that theory wouldn't really make sense. It could also be some kind of animal that had found its way inside, but we got a good look at it, and it didn't resemble any animal I've seen before. I have no idea what that thing was. I am normally a rational / Occam's razor kind of person, but we saw what we saw, and I have no explanation for it. A couple of years ago, I went on a study abroad trip with my university to Australia for a couple of months. We started in Darwin and traveled south. The bus ride itself was pretty uneventful, except for me and my friend being accidentally left at Devil's Marbles for a few hours, but that's another story. We stayed at a hostel in Alice Springs and got up before dawn to drive to Uluru. The rest of the students had decided to go back to sleep for the bus ride, but I was looking out the window at what little I could make of the scenery. It was that time right before dawn when you're first able to make out your surroundings. The bus slowed down to park and made a turn into an empty lot, and that's when I saw it. An extremely large shadow was walking through the bush. I'm a bad judge of height, but it was taller than any human I had ever seen, perhaps 10 feet tall with extremely elongated arms and legs. Even though there was enough light to make out details of the landscape, the figure appeared completely, well, detail-less. It was smooth, black, and featureless. The black was a stark contrast to the rest of the scenery, as there was a thin mist in the area. I've seen flashes of shadows driving before or something out of the corner of my eye, but this was different, as I was able to watch it for several slow seconds as he walked in this odd swaying, dipping motion with a distinct grace, moving effortlessly across the bush. I felt like, as soon as I saw it, I had been electrocuted, every hair standing up and skin prickling. I tried to wake my friend, but by the time she looked out the window, it was gone. I'm sure this could be explained by possible sleep deprivation or just seeing shadows, but I personally feel what I saw was real. 1 week ago, I was outside my house. I live in the mountains, in a little neighborhood. The neighborhood, however, has a forest in the back. Many of my friends joked about it being spooky and stuff, but no one knew anything more than it's kind of spooky. Anyway, I was outside because we have this game camera down in the forest. It was about 5:30, and my father told me to go get it. The neighborhood is atop this small hill, and there is a small ravine that attracts deer and moose. I walked down to the game camera and grabbed the SD card from the camera. Once I grabbed the SD card, I started to walk up the hillside. All of a sudden, I heard a branch or something break behind me. I turned around and spoke. I said something like hello, and I got no response. It had spooked me, so I started to walk back up, quite fast, I will say. Once I had gotten about 15 feet away, I turned around and saw that the camera was gone. It wasn't that dark, and I would have noticed had someone taken it down. It was just gone. I, staying where I was, peeked behind the tree. Nothing, and no one. I yelled this time, anyone there? Seriously, this isn't funny. That's when I saw it. It was white in color, but it was fast. I couldn't see it very well. It darted from one tree to another, running as if there was ground. The problem was that it was 5 feet above the ground. It looked humanoid in nature, but that could be my imagination. Anyway, I ran up the side of the hill and made it to my house. I closed the door and locked it. My parents checked the SD card but found that it hadn't taken a single photo. I told my parents about this experience, but my brother just said I was lying. Both my father and I walked down to the camera spot and checked. The camera strap was the only thing left. The camera attached to the trees by a Velcro strap. My parents explained it away as just an animal hitting it or something, but I know that they were worried because they locked the doors and windows that night, and my father slept with his baseball bat. Back in the early 1990s, I was a kid, around 13 at the time of this incident, and I used to stay at my grandparents' house a lot out in a very rural area in southeast Arkansas. There was a general store roughly 3 to 4 miles down the network of dirt roads. This was your typical country general store run by an old lady and her husband, and its only customers really consisted of the people who lived out there in BFE. One day my grandmother asked me if I wanted to walk to the general store and get her some milk, eggs, and a few other miscellaneous items, and I told her I would. She gave me some money, and I headed on my way. It's fairly early in the day, and I had plenty of time to get back before dark, which I always made sure to do when I was out roaming about. Things can get mighty creepy out in the backwoods of Arkansas after nightfall. I, being a 13-year-old, had poor time management skills. I stopped at the bottom of a hill next to this small wooden bridge you have to cross and messed around at the creek, catching crawdads and such, and I kind of just messed around the whole way to the store. By the time I left the store, I realized it was quickly approaching dark. I didn't want to be walking those lonely, secluded roads through the woods alone in the dark, so I hurried as fast as I could. By the time I had made it back to the bottom of the hill near the bridge, it was almost completely dark, and there was an eerie sort of glow brought about by a very bright, nearly full moon that was rising. As I top the hill, I can see the faint glow of the lights at their house, and I feel a sense of relief because I was kind of freaking out a little bit. As I walked up the road, I heard something from the left, behind me on the wooded side of the road. It sounded like leaves being rustled. I turned to look and saw nothing at first, but then, as my eyes began to focus, I saw something in the ditch, a black, shadowy shape slowly moving towards me. At first I thought it was a dog, but then I realized it was much too large to be a dog, and then I realized it wasn't actually walking on 4 legs, it was crawling, like a person would. I stared for a moment, out of sheer confusion, trying to figure out what I was seeing, and then a jolt of fear shot through me as it dawned on me that whatever this thing was, it had been trying to sneak up on me. At that exact moment, this thing stood upright out of the ditch on 2 legs, like a person. It had the shape of a human, long arms and legs, and was proportioned as such. It stood roughly 7 to 8 feet in height and was completely covered in black or maybe dark brown hair. Its face was dark in color, and I can't recall seeing much in the way of features due to it being night. It was no bear, for certain, or any other kind of animal I have ever seen, for that matter. I immediately dropped the bag of stuff I had been carrying and bolted as fast as my legs could take me towards my grandparents' house. I heard a heavy breathing / guttural growling kind of sound behind me and heard this thing's footsteps running behind me on the gravel as it gave chase. I did not turn around and was certain that it would grab me at any moment. I then heard it crash off into the woods and let out an earth-shattering and ungodly scream unlike anything I had ever heard before or since. I'm positive this thing could have easily caught me if it wanted to, but for some reason it let me go. By the time I reached my grandparents, my heart felt as if it would explode from the combination of the adrenaline rush I had from being scared beyond any type of fear I had ever felt before or since, and full on sprinting as hard and fast as possible for about a half straight mile. I flew into the house and, in an incoherent mess of hyperactive gibberish, tried to explain to my grandparents what had just happened. My grandmother didn't really seem to believe me, but she did believe something had scared me and acted rather weird about the whole thing. She tried to convince me it was just a dog or some other animal. The next morning I woke up and found my grandpa sitting outside whittling wood underneath the shade tree in the front yard, as he often liked to do. I went and sat down beside him on one of the old metal lawn chairs. He was a very rational man, down to earth, and had grown up in and hunted that area his entire life. He knew every inch two of it, mapped into his mind. He knew every type of critter and creature that lived in those woods, what noise they made, where to find them, how to catch them, etc. I had only been hunting with him for a couple of years, but I had been going out into those woods with him since a pretty young age on walks and such. He had passed a lot of his knowledge down to me during those adventures. I spoke to him about what had happened to me the night before and told him that I knew what I saw. He stopped whittling, looked me right in the eyes, and said, "I know what you saw. I've seen it before too. There's things out in the woods that people don't understand and that a person ought not go fooling with." My grandpa then went on to tell me that far back in the woods, there are some cliffs, and at the bottom of those cliffs is a cave. He told me that the cave was where the creature lived. He had once stumbled upon it a long time ago when he was hunting. He said he was standing on the top of the cliff looking at it when a creature fitting the same description emerged and began screaming wildly at him and throwing rocks. He said he took a shot at it, missed it, and then this thing gave chase to him. But my grandpa was on top of the cliff, so in order to get to him, this thing had to go around a pretty good distance and then up, which he said it quickly began to do, so he hightailed it out of there in a hurry. He said that the whole way back home, he felt as if he were being watched and kept hearing twigs snap behind him, and he was certain that it was following him, stalking him. He made it home, and as he reached his front porch, he turned and looked back at the woods from where he'd come and saw them peeking out at him from behind a tree. Later that night, he said that he and my grandmother awoke in the early morning hours to large rocks being thrown at the house, ungodly howling noises from outside, and this thing trying to get into the house. He said he could hear it walking around on the front porch, rattling the doorknobs, banging on windows, and it sounded like it was muttering to itself in a deep, garbled voice, but it didn't sound like a language, just a bunch of gibberish. After a while, the thing went back to throwing some more rocks and howling, so my grandpa grabbed his shotgun and fired it out the front door a few times into the darkness and the direction of the howling, and he said he heard it run back into the woods. He didn't know if he'd hit it or not. He said that was the last he'd ever seen or heard from it, but over the years, an occasional farmer's cow would be mutilated, someone's hunting dog would go unexplainably missing, or someone would have a story about some strange creature they'd seen. He also said it scared my grandmother beyond words, and she has absolutely refused to ever talk about it or even acknowledge that it happened. Which explains her acting weird about it when I told her what happened to me. I know what I saw, and my grandpa knew what he saw, and neither of us had ever felt the need to convince anyone else of it. In fact, until today, I had never actually spoken of it to anyone other than my grandpa, who passed away roughly 10 years ago. One summer when I was 14, so 6.5 years ago, I was staying the night at my grandparents' house, but it was just my grandma and me there. It was about midnight or so, and my grandma was already asleep. I was in the computer room, and the only light was coming from the computer screen. Their house was kind of U-shaped, with the right side being longer. The entrance was at the bottom of the U, and the left side of it was the master bedroom/bathroom, and the right side was the rest of the house. When you enter, the living room is to the right, and then there's a long hallway. First is the computer room, then the laundry room, then the kitchen and dining room. There's another small hallway that hooks off of that, where the other two bedrooms and bathroom were. I had heard a noise coming from that second, smaller hallway, and I went to check it out. I didn't turn any lights on as I was walking that way, and as soon as I turned the corner into that hallway, something hit the wall so loudly directly in front of my face. I ran away, and my heart was racing. As soon as I calmed down, I went back and turned on all the lights. They had a lot of paintings hanging, so I thought it might have been something like that had fallen, but nope, everything was in place. I have no idea what it was to this day. Other weird stuff happened in that house pretty often too. You'd hear weird noises that didn't make sense, the lights would turn on and off even though everything was newly remodeled. It was just creepy. My family was taking a trip to Pennsylvania to visit family, and we decided to hit a rest stop somewhere in Virginia. I don't remember what time it was, but it was really late, and we were the only people there. So as I start walking towards the building, something draws my attention to this huge tree off to the side. It was a slightly wooded area, so I had no clue why I was being pulled towards this certain one. I got this odd feeling of pure dread, and I saw an outline of a humanoid figure. It was completely black and had no features whatsoever. Mind you, this was in the shade of trees, probably sometime after midnight, so I would never have noticed if it hadn't pulled me towards it. As I looked at it, my fear grew. After a few seconds, the thing took off, darting behind another tree. The way it ran was the worst part of everything. It hunched over in an almost animalistic way. By this point, I was about ready to get back in the car and never look back, but I knew we wouldn't be stopping again. So I grabbed my mom, who was completely clueless, and ran to the bathroom. I was shaking so badly. I just wanted out of there, and I was so afraid whatever it was wasn't gone. Soon we left, and I just can't forget the way that thing looked as it ran off.